Okay, today we are going to pick up with the colonial heritage and look at how being a colony affected the Europe or the African countries, and how the influences of the Europeans who own them are going to affect them as well. So first off, we're looking at the colonial heritage. Heritage means things that have been passed down. So we're going to look at some economic changes. The colonial rulers, the Europeans who came into Africa, will introduce a lot of new crops and technology and cash economies that the Africans did not have before. But there's also some benefits that came about with colonial rule. They did build roads, they helped to build cities, they helped to build railroads and harbors, all that infrastructure kind of thing that Africans really hadn't been able to do for themselves at that point. The reason the Europeans were doing it was because they were trying to link the plantations and like the mines with the ships so they could get everything back to Europe. So they were doing it for their own benefit, but it ends up actually benefiting the African later independent countries as well. So they will export these goods and these minerals on roads in order to help pay for the expensive projects like railroads and that kind of stuff. So actually the Africans paid for it themselves with the resources that were being sent out and making lots of money for the Europeans. So there will be some political changes as well. Even after the Europeans leave and give the African nations independence, they still tended to have their nose in everything. They tended to dictate how these new African governments should govern and what kind of laws they should pass and all that stuff. Because they still tend to see the Africans as children who needed guidance. And in some ways they were, because the Africans weren't used to ruling themselves as a country. They were used to more of a tribal sort of governance. And so being left on their own, so to speak, and having to learn how to deal with new kinds of national government or a country as a government is very new to them. So yes, they are kind of like children in that respect. But the Africans were also expected to rule in democratic ways, which is tough because they don't they don't have any experience with it. They don't have any history with it. So it's really hard for them to understand how that works and how to make it work in a non-corrupt way. Education and healthcare will also be changed by the Europeans as they come into the colonies. Education and healthcare were provided by the missionaries, and not necessarily by the leaders of the government or anything like that. And typically it was only elementary schools. There weren't a whole lot of secondary schools like high schools or colleges. And so these will also be major changes that are going to be taking place. Now, as we look at the continent of Africa and how being a colony affected them, we're going to see some common problems across the continent. The first of the common problems is the artificial borders. The nations of Africa were based on how the colonies were set up, and this can create some problems because each of these countries didn't really pay attention to ethnicities or languages or anything like that, and so they're very diverse. Some African tribes were still very nomadic, and so they'd be crossing from one country into another, and that just created a whole nother slew of problems. And these countries needed to create a sense of unity in order to keep people in their country, because if they didn't feel like they were united, like their tribe wasn't being considered or anything like that, or treated fairly, they might up and leave your country for another, and so then you're losing population, you're losing revenue and all that kind of stuff. So it does create some interesting interactions among the nations of Europe. The second common problem is that there's just no ethnic homogeneity. There's just, in each nation, in each new country, there's such a mix of different tribes and cultures and traditions and languages, all kinds of stuff, and so it does create some problems. The third problem is that there were religious differences, not only with Christianity, but also Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist religions will be coming in, plus your polytheistic African native religions are a part of that as well. So that's going to create some problems, that they don't see themselves united in that way either. The fourth new problem is that the new leaders of the African countries are going to inherit very weak colonial governments. Very lavish, lots of money being spent, but they're not very strong as a government. And that's how they were set up as a colony, not to have a very strong government, because the They didn't want them to break away from the parent country. But lots of money being spent, so it looks good, but it's also very weak in terms of strength of can they make laws, can they change laws, that kind of stuff. The fifth problem is that the Europeans tended to keep what they considered to be theirs. And so you would have multinational corporations that still own mineral rights in Africa. Still today, they still own some of the mineral rights. They own some of the mines, the railroads, things that they considered to be their investment. And so the Europeans will continue to extract the best of the minerals from African countries. And these African countries are struggling financially, and so they could use these resources, but they don't have access to it. And so it really brings about the question of who controls the economy. What's fair? The person who created the mine or the railroad, or the people that that ability was sort of taken away from? So there's a lot of controversy about that, of who actually owns it. The sixth problem is that there's a lot of other economic problems going on in these African countries. A lot of the leaders tend to be fairly naive. They have these ambitious goals of what they want to do in their country, but they tend to back it up with deficit financing, that they're spending way more than they're making, and they're just going deeper and deeper into debt, and that's just going to cause problems. There's also a lack of personnel. They just don't have enough people that are actually educated and trained in government jobs or in special capacities. There's also a weak native industry. The Europeans weren't interested in building up the native industry. They were interested in taking the resources and taking them back to their country where they would then use it. So they weren't interested in creating factories and that kind of stuff in Africa itself. So they've got a lot of building up to do in that respect. On top of that, there's a lot of management that is uncoordinated, it's inept, it just doesn't do a good job. There's a lot of corruption that takes place, both at the governmental level, but also within industry and business. So that's going to cause some problems. Excuse me. The seventh problem is a population growth, and population growth in Africa is going to cause a variety of problems. There's a lot of things that come as a result of that. Some of it's migration of people moving from rural areas to urban areas, and some of them are coming as refugees, so they're coming with nothing typically, and so urban cities get overcrowded, and that's going to lead to some problems. Sanitation and transportation can't keep up with it. Quality of life in many African nations is going to be below international standards. They don't quite meet it. Life expectancy is going to be very low comparatively to the rest of the world, with 52 being the average for males and 55 the average for females. You compare that to the US, where it's like 76 and 78 or something like that. So drastically lower. Infant mortality rates are going to be incredibly high, and 45% of the people under the age of 15 are going to be involved in youth-related problems like lack of education and violence and crime and drugs and teenage pregnancy and all kinds of stuff like that. And then there's the obvious problem of AIDS, which is becoming much more of a problem today. So that is a problem too, because as the population grows, AIDS is going to spread more rapidly if they don't get educated and have safe sex and that kind of stuff. In 1970, Africa was still able to feed itself. It still could produce enough food to feed its population, but by 1980, just 10 years later, half of the population is starving, and it's been about that much or even more at times, depending on weather, and it just is an impossible situation. The eighth problem is that the governments of all these African countries have a lot of failures, things that they just aren't doing. They fail to conduct impartial elections. You remember, they're supposed to be a democratic sort of government, but they don't make sure they have free and impartial elections. They're not forcing people to vote for one party over another. They don't get accurate census data, so they don't even know how many people are in their country, how much money they're making on average, number of people in the family, all kinds of things that could be helped by knowing that information of, how much food should we start bringing in, how much money is that going to cost, and all that stuff that goes with that. Implementing family planning is something the government could do by saying, maybe you should consider birth control, or you should consider only having 2 2 or 3 children or whatever you can afford, offering health services and that kind of thing. And then they just have failed to develop agriculture enough to help feed their population. And that's been a constant struggle in Africa, is to feed their people. So there's a lot of different possible solutions out there that have been brought up. One is that maybe they should just return to being a colonial continent where the Europeans or Americans or whoever comes in and owns them as a colony, runs the government, so there's no more corruption, and maybe it's better for them that way. They have experienced people in government. The French and the U.S. tend to tie foreign aid to whether or not they're democracy and whether or not they observe human rights. There's some who have suggested that a possible solution is just to cut economic aid to them completely, that they either sink or swim, that if you do good, then you were meant to, and if you don't, well, then somebody needs to come in and take over, and maybe that's what's best for you. Others have said, well, if we do that, then there's a possibility of military intervention. All of the nations of Africa are going to turn into dictatorships, and is that what we really want? Is that what's best for Africa? And so ultimately it comes down to, well, who makes these decisions about Africa? Is it the colonial powers who were in control? Is that their decision? Are they responsible for it? Or are the Africans responsible for their own continued success or trying to make themselves a success in the world? So this brings about a really interesting scenario, because we do have a worst case scenario. If you want to look at one country that is kind of the epitome of everything bad that can happen in Africa, it's the country of Somalia. Somalia has a very hot climate. The tribes of Africa that lived in Somalia, in the Somali region, were typically nomads, using camels to travel across this hot, acrid climate. Many clans lived there, but typically they were of the Muslim faith. And Somalia, throughout its history, will have 4 colonial masters. First, it was a colony of the British, then the French, then the Italians, and then finally Ethiopia, which is kind of interesting because Ethiopia is also an African country. So African countries owned Somalia as a colony. Kind of interesting. So their independence will come in 1960. And that's basically because different parts of Somalia are going to merge together and create the country of Somalia. Shortly thereafter, a military dictator is going to take over, and his name is Sihad Bore, and he'll be in charge from 1969 till 1991, so for a fairly extensive amount of time. And while he is dictator, he mismanages the economy, he abuses his power, there's human rights violations, all kinds of stuff that is going on. Well, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are going to supply weapons to Somalia. Because they're both trying to have an influence. So we're not selling it to the same people, we're selling it to different people. The Soviet Union is selling to people who are pro-communist, and the US is selling to people who say they're pro-democratic. In 1991, the rebel group are going to chase Bore out of government, but they don't install a new government. And so the clans, the different tribes, are going to turn on each other, and a civil war erupts in 1991. So you have this horrible situation of a civil war erupting in 1991. On top of that, there's a large drug market in Somalia called khat, which is a narcotic. And the Civil War, it's kind of based with that too, the selling of drugs to get money, to get your weapons and all that kind of stuff. And then the Civil War is destroying farmland, so now you are going to have starving people because you don't raise enough food. On top of that, Somalia suffers the worst drought that they'd had in 50 years. And so nearly 4 million people are going to starve. Thousands every day are starving. About 2/3 of the population are going to be affected by this. So it's kind of like everything bad that could possibly happen happens in Somalia at the same time. It's just incredible. Their luck is that bad. Eventually, there will be international aid that is sent in, but it doesn't always reach the people it's supposed to. Fighting does occur. Food is stolen. People pay for bribes, and they have to pay protection money so they don't get killed or recruited into the military. UN troops and the US Marines are going to try and send in food, and it ends up being a huge debacle for us. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Black Hawk Down, but December of 1992, that's when that takes place, and it ends up being just this huge fiasco and unsuccessful. We just aren't doing very much good. We try, but we just don't do a whole lot of good. And so solutions for what do we do with Somalia? How do we make it better for people there? And aid workers are going to recommend and engineer that, well, maybe we just need to go in, take it over, and set up our own government the way that we want it. Is that what's best for Somalia? Is that what the people of Somalia want? Who knows? We don't know. It would take a lot of money. So there are a lot of programs for development out there to help the Africans. They do want to have unity. They do want to have stability. And so many of them are going to set up governments similar to those of the European country who had been their colonial masters. But typically those semi-democratic governments didn't work, and so one of four things is going to happen. Number one, you could have division of your people and civil war breaks out, like in Somalia. Countries were very diverse. They didn't agree, so there's a tendency for people to fight against each other. After they get their independence, which kind of unifies them against their European masters, their next loyalty is to their tribe, not to their whole society of Africans. It's more to the tribe. And so the diverse ethnic backgrounds often make for great conflict. And sometimes it's caused by religion, sometimes it's caused by customs, sometimes it's caused by the leaders. It just kind of depends on the situation in the country. Another thing that could happen after they gain their independence and the European government didn't work, they set up a one-party rule, which in some ways it could be more democratic. It offers you a choice of candidates without having to worry about political parties. And usually the leaders were the ones who helped to fight for the independence or the freedom. But typically what happens in a one-party rule is that people become very corrupt. The third thing that could happen is that you undergo a military dictatorship. And about half of the countries of Africa will suffer under military rule at some point after they gain independence. And typically these military dictators become too powerful, they become too brutal, and they just take advantage of their position. The fourth thing is that they're looking for some new solutions, trying out new ideas that had never been tried before. Some of them want to build on their traditions and go back to what they had before, like a tribal sort of government. Others want to take a more democratic approach and become more of a democracy where the people had more of a say, kind of like a direct democracy in some ways. So you can see that they really struggle to find what's going to work for them, but there's a lot of factors working against them too.